good now, or it's all getting good now, Bezos Hashem. Wow.
Yes, it's not only getting good now. Like I can phone, and Brian can use a computer, and we couldn't even get an order delivered last week from Tesco. My husband was like a cart horse walking to Tesco and back. In fact, he walked so much the trolley broke. Ha ha.
Wow.
That's exactly what he said. Yeah, still all good now.
Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. I think in the future, if you can find a way to reach out and let me know if you need a trip to the shop, it'd be a shame to schlep.
I can't go to the shops at the moment.
Correct, but if you give me a shopping list, list.
Oh, that's very kind. No, it's all right now. But
My wife trusts me with a shopping list.
Oh, she's a wonderful woman. No, now that we're back on the computer, my husband's already booked a date for next week for Tesco to deliver.
Oh, Baruch Hashem.
So that's good. And David Simcha gets other things. So we're all good. It's all working fine now.
I'm glad to hear. Baruch Hashem.
Yeah,
Wow.
Baruch Hashem.
yeah.
So dark.
Sorry?
I look so dark. You look so. It's all right. Dark. It's all right.
It's all good. We have nothing against dark colours.
No, that's probably all right. Better dark.
Be careful what you say in today's climate.
Yeah, that's true. This is true.
All lives count, as we know.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Indeed.
That's a much better saying.
Okay.
We good?
Baruch Hashem. All the better. Let's get involved because Shabbos part 2. Okay, we only get one Shabbos a week, but we do have 2 parts to the Shabbos Shir. Judaism at home, a massive part of Yiddishkeit at home has to be Shabbos. For the simple reason, Shabbos is probably the day we spend most at home, more so than any other day, which is good. And it's a big part of what Yiddishkeit teaches us. But if we're going to talk about how we make home special, how we celebrate the home, this has to be a major emphasis. And Shabbos isn't simple. It could be simplified, but even when it's simplified, it's still not simple. There's a lot of details to Shabbos. So last week, we spent a full 90 minutes, a full class, discussing the first half of Shabbos. And the way we split it up, we decided we're going to split. Half will be the zocher, the doing, the positive element of Shabbos, which more or less worked out to be the opening of Shabbos, the beginning part of Shabbos. If you don't mind, everybody, I'm going to do mute. But please do feel free to unmute at any time. It's *6 on the phone, or it's mute on the screen. And we're going to talk about what last week we said, Friday night, Zocher, positive, the doing parts of Shabbos, which included Kiddush, how we prepare for Shabbos, Shabbos candles, the meal, challah, getting dressed for Shabbos, and all those things that are fully involved about Shabbos. And those areas of Shabbos generally are associated more strongly with a Friday night. Not only, but on Friday night, you've got to start doing them, and therefore we learned about them last week. This week, we'll discuss the second half, if you like, of Shabbos. Part 2, we'll discuss more the shomer, the restrictions, or as we said last week, restrictions are only restrictions if we don't appreciate what they're leading us to. But after we learned last week how special a journey Shabbos is, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. So these restrictions are really the guidelines, the system, or the infrastructure in which we can thrive with Shabbos. And those are the things we refrain from doing. And that's what we're going to discuss quite a bit today. And it's going to be focused also, starting off with the daytime part of Shabbos, but because that's where some of the restrictions are even more pronounced. And then we're going to go through, besides for the daytime meal and the malachas, we'll discuss practical Shabbos. Now, practical Shabbos isn't so much an overview, but it's how we take the overview of Shabbos and how it makes our Shabbos look different. So if we're starting from somewhere, what are the most obvious things that are going to be different by keeping Shabbos? And that way we make it more practical. And then we'll end off with talking with Havdalah, ending Shabbos ceremony. And if we get to that, then of course, course conclusion, because today is the last class. I do want to say that I've been preparing a quiz. And this quiz is not a test. But one of my colleagues actually in Long Island in America suggested this, and I thought it was a lovely idea, where he did the similar kind of thing. So I'm borrowing his and working off that, where he says we all have a code of law when it comes to driving. We have a code of law when it comes to society. When it comes to Yiddishkeit, we have the Shulchan Aruch, and this will be creating our own mini Shulchan Aruch, Judaism at Home book of rules. So I'll send out the quiz. There'll be optional answers. So you'll get to choose between the three answers. If I remember correctly, the first question on the quiz is, what is the first thing you do in the morning? Option A, say Maida Ani. Option 2, say the Shema. And option 3, kiss the mezuzah. Okay, so they're not complicated questions. And if you get it right, you mark yourself. And if you get it wrong, then you correct yourself. And then you have your own mini code of law, your own mini Shulchan Aruch to keep or to throw out or to do whatever you want with it. That's the idea. If anyone has any comments, suggestions, or questions at any point during the class, please do unmute yourself, either on the screen or *6 on your phone. And here we're going to jump right in to try and work towards the course conclusion, and thereby be able to pack in as much information today as you can in a realistic manner. And then, as we said, hopefully in the email, we'll add in that quiz with additional sheet that has the answers and the cheats and the giveaways. Okay, Shabbos day is different than Friday night. If you can think of a practical difference between Shabbos mode Friday night and Shabbos mode Shabbos day, I would love to hear. If you can think of a difference of how we behave, how we prepare, how we approach Friday night compared to Shabbos day, please share. Anybody? Not all at once. Okay, I'm going to make a suggestion. If you can relate to it, listen carefully, it's a good idea. But which do you feel more? I'm going to use a Yiddish word. Which do you feel more Shabbos-dik? Shabbos feelings are more pronounced Friday night? Does it feel more Shabbos-ly or Shabbos day? And the truth is that for most people, Friday night feels much more special. You feel something unique about Friday night. Whereas Shabbos day, it doesn't feel quite the same specialty always. Obviously, some people are going to say, no, that doesn't work for me. But for the majority of people, this is the way it is. And actually, in the Kabbalah, it discusses why that might be the case. And the short of it is that practically the difference between driving at 60 miles an hour to slowing down to 0 is quite a difference, and you can feel that difference. But going from 0 and staying at 0, so the whole week we're running around doing everything, and then Friday night we come to a short stop and we stop. That's a massive change, and you can feel that. But the change from Friday night, which we've already acclimatized to and we're already used to, Shabbos day doesn't feel quite the same difference. And that's the practical side of it. But the mystical side of it is that Friday night is the shift from the mundane to the holy. And that's a tangible difference. And then the shift from Friday night to Shabbos day is supposed to be digging deeper, more soulful, more spiritual, which is less of a shift, less of a change in a tangible way. It's taking place inside. It's taking place inside. And when it's inside, it's less in the open. And that's why we don't feel it, because it's an experience that's supposed to be totally consuming, totally of a change. In other words, it's not less felt because it's less there. It's less felt because it's so deep. It's even deeper than that. Sometimes we do things to make a change, and sometimes you just have to be. Just be. And Shabbos is going to be a bit like that. On Shabbos day, we celebrate not so much what we do differently, but more we're celebrating how we are different. And that's much deeper. That's much deeper. And we're going to explain it by pointing out some of the differences in davening. Now, during the week, we mentioned that we do the Amidas, the highlight of a prayer service, of any prayer service, Shachris, Mincha, Marav, morning, afternoon, evening. Whenever we do a davening, the highlight, the climax of a davening is the Amida. During the week, that's where we would do our personal requests. So I'm asking Hashem to grant me wisdom, grant me livelihood, grant me refuah, healing, whatever else I might be asking for, that's in the middle, the center of the Amidah, not on Shabbos. On Shabbos, we step up beyond that. Instead of asking for our needs, we ask to be connected to Hashem. And therefore, instead of having 19 blessings, 3 in the beginning, 3 in the end, and 13 in the middle, all 13 of the middle are taken out, and we put in just one single bracha in the middle of the Amidah. But what's amazing is that the 3 times we daven on Shabbos, the 4 times, each one has a different central bracha. So you would imagine it'd be the same now. Friday night, it's on the screen right here. Friday night we say, Ata kidashta yom hashvi. You are sanctified the Shabbos. Shabbos day, we talk about Moshe. Yismach Moshe b'matnas chalkoi. Moshe rejoiced, the joy that Moshe taught us over Shabbos. The matana, the gift of Shabbos, is a Shabbos of joy. By the time we get to Shabbos afternoon and Mincha time, we're saying something else. Ata echad, v'shimcha echad. You are one. We talk about the unity of Hashem. So clearly we can see that something's not the same Friday night, Shabbos day, Shabbos afternoon. And we're going to talk about what's changing and how we can go along with that. Here's another nuanced difference, and that is that when we talk about resting on Shabbos in the Amidah, so there's again a difference. Friday night, we rest v'yanuchu va. Kol Yisrael mekadosh shemecha. We rest in her in Shabbos. Shabbos day, in the morning, we rest v'yanuchu v'y. Kol Yisrael mekadosh shemecha. We rest in him in Shabbos. And then Shabbos afternoon gets changed again. V'yanuchu vam kol Yisrael. We rest in them. So it's Shabbos her, him, or them. And it depends what time of the day. So clearly something's changing here. And actually, we're going to learn that this is very, very part of these are indicators to tell us what this journey of Shabbos could and should look like for us. Because Shabbos is a journey. It's not a static. You're in it or you're out of it. We start off at the beginning and we journey our way deeper and deeper into Shabbos, more involved. And the hope is that we manage to get through these steps. So let's put it on the screen. We're going to take marriage in Jewish thought and use that as an example to help us appreciate what's happening on Shabbos. The short of it is, Shabbos is when we and Hashem, God Almighty, come together in marriage. Shabbos is the day where we get connected with Hashem, and that's a gradual process. Hopefully, anybody who's married could appreciate this, but the beginning of marriage should be the beginning. And as we go along in life, we should be growing up that way. We should be getting more and more invested. That's the ideal. We should be more and more connected. And if that's the ideal, we're going to talk about how it works in Jewish thought, first of all in marriage, and then borrow that back to the way the ideal Shabbos should look as well. So halachically, marriage takes place, and there's 2 distinct mitzvahs, ceremonies that have to take place for a bride and groom to be fully married. One ceremony is called Kiddushin, which practically is the ring ceremony, where the groom gives the bride a ring and announces to her, explains to her that this ring will be for marriage, and she accepts that ring for marriage. Thereby, they've both made a transaction that has moved them from being unmarried to being married. And once she accepts that ring, legally they're married. The only thing that could break such a marriage, God forbid, is a divorce or death. They're fully married, but they're not yet allowed to live together. So they're technically married, but not actually married. A very interesting setup. And that is a required step that has to take place before step number 2, which is nisuin, under the chuppah, by standing together under the same chuppah, saying the Sheva brachas, the special blessings. And then it's certainly in the Ashkenaz custom has to take place right away. In the Sephardic custom can take place a little later, but the bride and groom have to spend time in seclusion together. He invites her into his home. And then once he's bringing her into his domain, that's nisuin. Practically today, they both take place at the same time. We do the Kiddushin and the Nisuin both under the same chuppah. But in Talmudic times, this was done months apart. The Kiddushin would be in the beginning, and she would go and prepare, like we may have engagement time, and then months later do the marriage. In those times, they would actually have the ring of Kiddushin, and she would be legally married, but living at home, not moved in yet. And if you can imagine how many problems that could cause, especially if there's no communication. I mean, we were just listening before. What happens if someone's phone line goes down and there's no way to communicate? Top that up with very risky ways of travel, and having a woman married with a husband hasn't even brought her home yet could be very tricky. And that's why they've kept nowadays marriage, both parts of marriage take place together, Kiddushin and Nisuin. But this is the idea. Step one, the ring where they're legally married, and step two, Nisuin. Now, what's amazing is that the woman who got the ring and is not going to get married under the chuppah for months would still be living at her home, her parents' home. Whereas the second part of marriage would traditionally take place in the groom's home, because that's the way he's taking his newlywed wife back to his home. And that's going to be an important part in appreciating the journey of Shabbos, which emulates and copies the journey of marriage. So Friday night is going to be Kiddushin step. Shabbos day is going to be Nisuin, which explains why at Friday night, the blessing on the Amida talks about Ata Kiddashta, you have sanctified, made holy. And that's really what the Kiddushin does. Kiddushin is the same word as Kiddashta. And that's how we say, V'yinuchuva, let's rest in her domain, because she's still living at home. That's the similarity. Where she's only started the excitement of marriage, and there's a big change in her life that she now knows that she's married, but she hasn't yet moved in. Shabbos day, we talk about Yismach, Moshe, the joy of marriage that comes, not just the excitement, but the fact that there's an internal joy. Joy is much more than excitement. I remember hearing from my teacher that excitement is another word for distraction.
Yeah.
You could call it what you want, but the more I think about it, the more I appreciate that. It's so exciting to go to an amusement park and sit on a roller coaster that turns you upside down. Is that joy? It's not joy, it's just exciting. It's a tremendous distraction. Instead of thinking what I need to do next, I'm turning upside down on a roller coaster, speeding up and down hills. It takes me nowhere. But that's excitement. It's important though, because it gets me excited about what I'm about to do. But the joy of Shabbos is the second step. Once they start internalizing it, coming home. And that's where she's now moved in with him. We've moved in with Hashem. And at that point, it's for Yenuchavoi, we rest with him. So what's the afternoon time? The afternoon time is as the marriage progresses, as we begin to live together and join in together. That's no longer just him or her. At that point, Ato Echad, you are one. That's the unity, and that's Vayenuchuvam. It's no longer at his house, and she's at his house. By now, it's our house. We're in this together, and that's the unity that's accomplished as Shabbos progresses. So really, Shabbos is a journey. And as we progress through the journey, it's very important for us not just to wake up in the morning and say, you know what, whatever I did yesterday, I'll do more of the same. Don't sell yourself short. Don't sell Shabbos short. Try and make Shabbos even more special as the day progresses. And I think that besides to realizing the nuances in the holy words of the Siddur, of the davening, we can also learn practical life lessons from the basic words that we say in davening. It's important to study the davening. It's important to spend time on the davening. And if we have time at home, perhaps that's one of the things we might do on a Shabbos, because this really will enhance that relationship between me and my beloved. Hashem is my creator. Hashem is reaching out to me on Shabbos, every Shabbos. And that's why using out the Shabbos to journey this journey is so powerful. So the steady growth of Shabbos is clear. At least we've spent some time on it. We're going to talk now a little bit about how Shabbos looks like in the Shabbos morning. We're going to leave. Yes, please. Question time.
Can you please repeat? I missed out a little bit. Who is the bride and who is the groom again?
I'm glad you asked, because we've actually borrowed two schools of thought. One school of thought has Shabbos as the queen and us as the groom. But then there's a different metaphor that's going on as well. And today we focus on the other metaphor. Shabbos is the wedding. We are the bride and Hashem is the groom. So there's two different metaphors going on. It's very easy to mix them up because we call Shabbos Malkasa, but the concept is the same. Regardless of who's the bride and who's the groom, the idea is that we are creating a working relationship or enhancing a working relationship with our Creator. And the time to do that, more than any other time, is Shabbos, because that's the time where we focus inwards. And so in practical terms, you might have a couple, a spouse who is working very hard all week out there at home or out there at work, whatever they're doing. And at a certain point, we have to stop running around and come home for a little bit. And that's really the main focus. And the same things with us and our Creator. The whole week we're busy doing things, and Shabbos we come home. So to answer your question is, it's complicated. That's the short answer. But that's what we're saying is that in this metaphor today, we used us as the bride and Hashem as the groom. Did we answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Shamor v'zachor, does that relate?
Very much so. Very much so. Shamar v'zachor are two parts. We spoke about a little bit Shamar v'zachor, guard Shabbos and remember Shabbos or honor Shabbos. We spoke about that last week. That's why we have two candles. We also spoke about the positive instructions that we have. And today we're going to be focusing on the prohibitions that we refrain from in order to make Shabbos thrive. But the idea of refraining, we're going to make an emphasis on this. You know, I'm going to jump the gun for a second and talk about it now, even though we're about to talk about it at the next point. But this is important. Not doing things on Shabbos, although they are, you could call them negative, restrictive. But these are the ways in which we can thrive. What's the famous analogy of the violinist where she's preparing a violin and she's tightening the strings and the kid comes over to her and says to her, what are you pulling those strings so hard for? Isn't music where you go free and you express yourself and you can do whatever you want? What's with pulling the strings so hard? What's with tightening them so tight? And then she tells them, look, if I can tighten these strings tight, then I'm free to fly anywhere with the music. But if I keep these strings loose, if my sets of rules are loose, then I go nowhere because the music doesn't play. And that's the kind of idea of Shabbos. Shabbos does set us free, so long as we switch on Shabbos. And therefore, the rules of Shabbos are exactly that. The shomer, the protection of Shabbos, is what allows us to enjoy and honor Shabbos. In a marriage, this is equally important. Using marriage as a metaphor, of course, love is what the fuel of marriage, but the framework of marriage is respect. And of course, if there's no love, then it's a dull marriage. But love without respect is so consuming, so all-consuming, it doesn't know any breaks. And therefore, it consumes the marriage also. But if there's a framework, if there's respect, if the brakes are ready and working, now you're ready to soar far. Great. And that's the idea of Shabbos, the healthy balance of the both. We're going to get back to that soon. But before we do that, we're going to focus for a little bit on the Shabbos day. And we're going to do that not so much about talking about the prayers, because it's a lengthy prayer. It's probably one of the longest prayers we have throughout the week. It is. But on Shabbos day, after davening, however long it takes, whatever time you start, whatever time you finish, whatever time you wake up, whatever time you're doing it, your Shabbos day meal, very similar to the Friday night meal, in which we have to have, there we go, Kiddush. We make Kiddush over wine, although it's a slightly different text. We wash our hands. We make bread, bracha over bread, 2 whole loaves again. And we have a lavish meal. We sit down again to have a proper sit down, not a dinner, but a lunch. And that lunch should be full on, proper sit down, white tablecloth, put it out. And ideally in the halacha, it talks about having also fish. And I guess in a separate course, having meat. You can't have fish or meat in the same course. So I mentioned that last week. But yeah, having a full-on meal. And of course, traditionally, the Shabbos day meal, the highlight is cholent in Ashkenazic English, or chulent, or cholent, however you want to call it. And in the Sephardic lingo, it's chamin, which is warm food. It's the same sort of idea. And today, we're going to talk a little bit about what cholent is, how it's made, and what makes it so Shabbos day. So first of all, cholent is served warm. It's a warm dish. Now you got to remember that on Shabbos day, you can't turn on the fire. You can't put any pots on the fire, which we'll talk about soon as well. And therefore, the only way to get a warm meal served on Shabbos day, if it's been put on the fire before Shabbos began. Now, when does Shabbos begin? Friday night, candle lighting time, which is way back when. It's the beginning of Friday night. So now the whole Friday night and the whole Shabbos morning until whatever time you're eating your cholent, this hot cholent dish is being sat simmering on the fire. That's the first introduction to what cholent looks like. It comes from the fact that the verse tells us you shall not cause fire to burn in anyone dwelling in the places on Shabbos, and that's why we have it, a warm dish on Shabbos, being simmering from before. There's a mitzvah to have a Shabbos delight, to have warm food, and that's why it's important to serve food that's nice to eat. And nice food to eat is warm food. Eating cold food isn't half as nice as warm food, and that's why we have it. But also, importantly, by having warm food on Shabbos day, this reminds us of a very important belief that was questioned and challenged throughout Jewish history, and Jewish people do things to emphasize and to highlight our faith in our tradition, Mosaic tradition, the tradition of Moshe Rabbeinu. And that was the basic text that we read earlier. Oops, where are we going here? We read earlier, the pasuk says, you shall not cause fire to burn in any of your dwelling places on Shabbos. Literally read, could seem like that you cannot have fire burning on your house on Shabbos. But of course, we know that in order to properly understand the written text, we must follow the oral text and the oral tradition, which tells us that means that this is telling us that the fire cannot be lit on Shabbos, but from before Shabbos you can. There was a sectarian group called the Karaites, and they came along and said, no, there's no light on Shabbos, there's no fire on Shabbos, and they would sit in the cold dark over Shabbos. In order to make sure to emphasize that we're not following them, we make sure to have Shabbos light, but also a warm food on Shabbos day, which by definition requires a fire to be burning throughout Shabbos, at least till that point, and thereby confirming our acceptance of Moshe tradition. So cholent is not only a delicious food, it's also a food of faith, a food that emphasizes how we believe in the tradition, and we believe that Hashem is still in control of how the tradition is passed on from generation to generation. I'm going to put on a short clip that I have from one of the previous courses that we did. It's from the Jewish course of why, but it's a little comical clip that describes some of the details that we just explained, and also a little window into what cholent actually is. It's not that long, it's about 2-3 minutes, but here we go. Whoop.
Step into a traditional Jewish kitchen on Shabbat afternoon and encounter a simmering, slow-cooked dish with a mouth-watering aroma. A glance through Deuteronomy won't help you with this one. The label for this culinary creativity has an onomatopoeic ring similar to infamous Yiddish words, such as chutzpah and schlep. Yes, cholent and chulent is often chunky, heavy, and likely to turn a Shabbat afternoon power nap into a blissful deep sleep. Hard to rise experience. Heinrich Heine, a foremost 19th century poet, exchanged his Jewish religion for academic acceptance, but found himself anchored by a weighty pot of savory delight. In his poem, Princess Sabbath, the apostate describes the Shabbat queen singing the praises of shalet, the original Yiddish word for cholent.
She denies her love on nothing, save the smoking of tobacco. Dearest, smoking is forbidden, for today it is the Sabbath. But at noon, as compensation, there shall steam for thee a dish, that in very truth divine is. Thou shalt eat today of shallot. Shallot, ray of light immortal. Shallot, daughter of Alicia. So had Shirah's song resounded, had he ever tasted shallot. For this shallot is the very food of heaven, which on Sinai God himself instructed Moses in the secret of preparing.
Heinrich's depiction of God sharing the cholent recipe on Mount Sinai may not be altogether fantastical. Did I mention that Deuteronomy won't be of help? Indeed, but the book of Exodus will. The verse forbids lighting fire on Shabbat. A stew simmering over a flame lit before the start of Shabbat is the obvious solution for Jews seeking to fulfill their biblical obligation to honor Shabbat with a good dish, prepared uniquely for the holy day. Jewish tradition defines good as meat or fowl. Jewish stomachs define good as a warm meal, not a cold one. Jewish ingenuity took these factors and created cholent in all its glorious variations. But cholent became a national sensation due to defectors of another kind. An ancient breakaway Karaite sect embraced literal Bible interpretation and denied the oral tradition taught by Moses and the sages. They insisted that fire not be present on Shabbat at all, 24 hours without light, heat, or warm meals. As a vote of confidence in Mosaic tradition, faithful Jews kept slow-cooked stews on fires that burned throughout Shabbat. Just a spoonful of cholent, and you'll know the Karaites were hopelessly wrong.
Okay, so don't forget your cholent. It's very important. If you haven't tried it yet, do try it. It is heavy. Moving right along from the Shabbos daytime delicious, lavish meal, we're going to talk about the general idea of restrictions or prohibitions on Shabbos. And we're going to talk about why we have them, what they are, and how we can practically navigate them. That's going to be the next part of today's class. Until every time we finish that, we'll be ready for Havdalah. So let's start off with talking about how many rules are there on Shabbos. There are actually 39 rules, 39 groupings of halacha that tell us what we should not be doing on Shabbos. One of them being lighting fire or cooking. Hence the idea of cholent, which allows us to have warm food without cooking or lighting a fire on Shabbos. But there are actually 39 groupings of rules that make Shabbos the holy day it can become. There's a beautiful analogy that the Chafetz Chaim used to try and help his students understand and appreciate why we shouldn't question the mitzvahs and the restrictions of Shabbos. And the way he described it was, he used an analogy where you had an officer of a great king, who the king is sending on a mission to attend a party at one of his neighboring countries, whatever celebration. And before he journeys away, the king asks him to do him one favor. Come what may, do not enter into any bets. Don't take a bet. There's going to be a party and there'll be a lot of talking and this, that, banter and the rest. No bets, please. And of course, the officer says, yes, absolutely. And he travels off. Off he goes. And at the height of the party, one of the neighboring countries, ministers, whatever, challenges this guy and says to him, I will bet you 50,000 pounds that you have a large mark on your back. If you have a mark on your back, you pay me 50,000 pounds. If you don't have a mark on your back, then I pay you 50,000 pounds. The guy's like, this is the stupidest thing. All I got to do is take off my shirt and it's 50,000 pounds. He says, fine, bet. You sure? Sure. They shake on it. He takes his shirt off and there, sure enough, there's no mark on his back. 50,000 pounds later, he's as happy as Larry and eventually comes back. He comes to the king and the king says, "Nu, did you do any bets?" He says, "King, you won't believe it. It was the stupidest bet. The guy gave me 50,000 pounds because I had nothing on my back." Says the king to this minister, "What did you do?" "I bet the other monarch that you would never take your shirt off in public. And I bet 100,000 pounds that you wouldn't. And you gave that up. For 50,000 pounds, you took your shirt off in public." Says the Chafetz Chaim, we think we've got it all figured out. I'll take my shirt off and I'll have 50,000 pounds. What I don't realize is that by doing that, something that I was unaware of, or something much beyond what I took into account, is being sacrificed for this small gain. And therefore, adhering to the monarchs, to his officer, to his hierarchy, his boss's instruction is very important. Says the Chofetz Chaim, when it comes to Shabbos, oftentimes we don't get it. And it doesn't necessarily make sense to us. But what we do get is that we are smaller than Hashem. And our perspective, however broad it is, doesn't include everything in life. And Shabbos is the same. So what we're going to do is try and put some perspective into the mitzvahs that we do, but bearing in mind that whatever we understand, we also understand that we don't understand everything. And that's probably the only thing we can be sure of. We can be sure that we don't get everything. If we thought we get everything, we would never learn. But we can be sure that we don't get it all. And therefore, although we're going to go now and put some good understandings into Shabbos and appreciating how it works, let's bear in mind that whatever we do understand is a taste of what's really out there. And we say out there, up there. So we're going to start off with one text that's going to put into us an appreciation of why Shabbos is so important to us. And for the benefit of those of us who are on the phone, I'm going to read this out slowly. It's a beautiful text. It's based on Mecklenburg. But we're going to read it in text the way it's written in English from Diane Isidore Grunfeld in the book called Shabbos. The Shabbos testifies to God as the supreme creator of heaven and earth and all they contain. So Shabbos is a testimony that Hashem is the creator, supreme creator of heaven and earth. Man, however, is engaged in a constant struggle to gain mastery over God's creation, to bring nature under his control. By use of his God-given intelligence, skill, and energy, he has in a large measure succeeded in this. The human being has changed creation enormously. He is thus constantly in danger of forgetting his own creaturehood, his utter and complete dependence on the Lord of all things. He tends to forget that the very powers he uses in his conquest of nature are derived from his creator, in whose service his life and work should be conducted. So throughout the week, we're rushing around, controlling and manipulating nature, which is actually what we were born to do. But there's almost like a occupational hazard, where when we're doing the work that we're doing, we run the risk of thinking that we are it, forgetting that actually we are just creations in Hashem's creation. And therefore come along Shabbos. In a world increasingly forgetful of God, Israel was entrusted with the task of preserving this all-important truth for the future salvation of all mankind. God willed, therefore, that the Jew, while subduing and controlling his environment like every other human being, must recognize and show that he recognizes that his powers are derived from the one higher than himself. This recognition he is to express by dedicating one day in every week to God, and by refraining on this day from every activity which signifies human power over nature. I'm just going to read that last sentence again. One day in each week, by refraining on this day from every activity which signifies human power over nature. Human power over nature. We're going to come back to that. On this day, we renounce every exercise of intelligent, purposeful control over natural objects and forces. We cease from every act of human power in order to proclaim God as the source of all power. By refraining from human creating, the Jew pays silent homage to the Creator, Hashem. So this is a beautiful appreciation of Shabbos, that it's not so much that we need a break and we need to stop doing everything, sit on the couch and do nothing. It instead is actually exactly the opposite. We're actively investing in something even more important than doing. And what is that? We're actively investing in realigning and refocusing on who we are and what we are. What is it that we're doing? But more importantly, who are we? Besides for what we're doing. The whole week we're busy doing this, that, and the other. Come Shabbos, we go back to reminding ourselves, who am I? What am I? A creation of the Creator. And everything that I have is exactly that, tools that the Creator has given to me so that I can do all the important things that I'm doing for the other 6 days of the week. Hence the famous quote, Shabbos minei misbarechin kol hayomin. From Shabbos, from the 7th day, comes the blessing for the entire 6 days that follow.
היום יום ראשון בשבת, היום יום
Allah, exactly. Every day we remind ourselves, as we spoke about last week, this is part of the Shabbos experience, and we're working towards Shabbos, but also that Shabbos is the focus for the rest of the week. I want to say that the 39 categories of forbidden work, which we're going to talk about now for a few minutes, actually are the 39 categories that will help us realign who we are instead of what we need to do. The whole week we're doing things, and these are the ways, if we refrain from these, we're able to stop doing and start focusing on who we are. Work. The guy in the picture is schlepping a couch. I love the word schlepping. Schlepping's in English. It's almost in English. But to schlep a couch is hard work, you would imagine. Yet, we're going to learn that actually schlepping is not one of the 13 categories that are forbidden in Shabbos. So if you need to move something that's heavy and it's part of keeping Shabbos, that's fine. It's not one of the forbidden works. So what is a forbidden work? And the answer is going to be creative, human control over nature. When we change nature, the creativity that we apply, human skill, human knowledge, that will change nature, that is malacha. And we're going to put this in the Hebrew word. The Hebrew word for schlepping or for hard work is avodah. Avodah is hard work. The Hebrew word for the forbidden works on Shabbos are not avodat or melacha. And melacha means creative work. Amazingly, the 39 groups are not hard work. It's much harder to walk a half an hour to get to shul on Shabbos than it is to flick a light switch. Yet walking to shul is considered the right way because driving is melacha, but flicking a light switch is not allowed, and that's instead you have to do whatever it is because the melacha is what's forbidden. Interestingly, you might have been to a Shabbos meal where the hostess is rushing around working so hard to entertain everybody, but she's perfectly kosher on Shabbos. And that's much harder than perhaps, I don't know, picking up the phone or switching on the TV, because TV is not allowed. That is malacha. Whereas hard work is allowed because that's not the creative work that's forbidden on Shabbos. This is important to appreciate because if we talk about making Shabbos holy, or another word for holy would be godly, making Shabbos like Hashem. Hashem rested on the 7th day. We rest on the 7th day. Hashem wasn't sweating for 6 days and then needed a break. Hashem doesn't sweat. Hashem doesn't work hard. But what did Hashem do on the 7th day? The creativeness, where Hashem was manipulating or creating nature, that's what he stopped on Shabbos. That's what we stop on Shabbos. We copy Hashem. Not that we don't do things that are difficult, but we don't do things that are creatively using our skill and knowledge to change the world around us, to manipulate nature. And that's what we don't do on Shabbos. So, malacha work is using knowledge, skill to make a positive change in nature. Schlepping is permitted because effort is not what's relevant. And therefore, avodah is permitted, but malacha is not. So that's the introduction to understanding and appreciating what things would be permitted on Shabbos and what things are forbidden. I just want to share with you an interesting anecdote that I once heard when learning the laws of Shabbos. You have the person who happens to be a foreman at a big factory, and his job is to keep an eye that the whole floor is running well. And comes Shabbos, he says to himself, you know what, if I'm not going to work on Shabbos, I'm going instead to go to the beach, take my family out for a barbecue, we'll go for a swim, and we'll have a good time. So he gets into his car with his family, packs up a barbecue, throws it on the fire, grills a whole bunch of meat, goes out for a swim, and before you know it, he's broken about 17 different of the categories that are forbidden. You can't drive, you can't light a fire, you can't cook, you can't go swimming, you can't squeeze out, you can't carry, all the different things we're going to talk about. Had he gone to his job where he's literally walking next door to the big factory and hasn't lifted a pen, but he just stood there. He's done nothing wrong, strictly speaking. Of course, it's not in the spirit of Shabbos, but the 39 categories of law are not about the spirit of Shabbos. And I'm going to borrow that for a second, because spirit of Shabbos, we often hear the word bounce around. You can't do that. It breaks the spirit of Shabbos. Strictly speaking, spirit of Shabbos and getting the atmosphere of Shabbos is not one of the 39 forbidden works. The 39 forbidden works are of biblical level. The spirit of Shabbos is protected by rabbinic legislation, but that's where it is. So the laws of forbidden work on Shabbos are much more important and much more relevant than protecting the spirit of Shabbos. The spirit of Shabbos protection is almost like an add-on, a preventative measure that will protect the laws of the forbidden work. So if we want to know, strictly speaking, what we should be most careful about on Shabbos is making sure that wherever we're engaging or not engaging in fits in with the 39 categories. Okay, so that's my introduction. If anyone has any questions or suggestions, comments to make, please do feel free to speak up, because now's a good time. And then from here, we're going to move straight on to some of the malachas, the groupings and the categories of the 39 works.
Levi, I have a request
Please.
for Shayna for a vegetarian recipe of cholent.
You have to go to Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai, when God gave the Torah, the recipe included meat. I'm joking. I'm having a laugh. Yes, there are plenty. Today, there are loads of parav cholents, non-meat, dairy-free, meat-free cholents, and they are very, very good. Some of them include imitation meat, like soy. You don't need that. My favorite cholent doesn't have any meat in it, but of course, Shayna makes both. Yes, let's be in touch after the class for some good recipes.
Thank you.
I like that comment.
And
Okay.
Rabbi, you've not mentioned, so the 39 melachot
Yes?
is relating to the Mishkan.
Absolutely. We're going to get there right now.
Okay.
That's where we're going next. We're going to talk about the 39 categories. Where do the 39 categories of forbidden work come from? So here's where we're going to talk about for a few minutes, the idea of the written Torah, the way we read the 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of the Torah, and we have an oral spoken tradition. Which one of those came first? The spoken law or the written law? Those of us who have been in these classes before are going to guess the answer right away, but you would assume that the written law is the main thing, and the spoken law has things grow ears, nose, and tails, and whatever, and the story grows and becomes as generations pass along. The truth is, it's the other way around. The written Torah was not written down until 40 years after the spoken Torah was received. Moses came down from the mountain, and when he came down to the mountain, he smashed the tablets. The tablets were the first form of written law and had on them only 10 commandments. That was 40 days after those same 10 commandments were spoken. So which came first? The spoken 10 commandments or the written 10 commandments? The spoken. And only 40 days later, we had the first form of written law, and those were smashed, and it took another 80 days after that to get a replacement. So the written 10 commandments were 120 days after the spoken. But the Torah scroll as we know it was only written on the last day of Moshe Rabbeinu's life. And that was 40 years later. And for those 40 years, the Jewish people had only the spoken law aside for the 10 commandments. They had those in written notes, which each one of them had, and the leaders and the masters and the dayanim and the Beth Din had, but there was no written Torah, because the written Torah was written down at the end of 40 years. Almost like you might go to a lecture and take some notes. The notebook that you have only works because you've been to the lecture. You've heard the spoken law. Hashem spoke to us through Moses and dictated word for word, mitzvah by mitzvah, detail by detail, every single element of every mitzvah. And as a part of making sure that we don't have Chinese whispers, and very important checks and balances in place, so that 3,000, 3,500 years later, we are absolutely certain that we're following the code of Jewish law in its entirety or its in original form. Part of that is that we have a written document that backs up the spoken tradition. But which is more important, the spoken law or the written law? So tangibly, you can hold onto a written document, and that makes it the holiest item that we have. But the spoken tradition dates back to earlier than, it's certainly more inclusive than, but also is the more vital part of our book of law. And for many generations, the spoken law was exactly that, only spoken. It was in the times of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, where he wrote down the Mishnah, which was the first written form of the spoken tradition. But generally speaking, that is the far more inclusive part. And many a time, the sages found clues, hints, and allusions to the spoken law fitted into the written halacha. One example of that is the 39 categories of work on Shabbos. Moshe Rabbeinu came down the mountain and taught us those 39 groups. But in the Torah, in the written form, we have a way of remembering that. What's the way of remembering that? Well, the Torah tells us how the Jews were instructed to build a tabernacle, a mobile temple, a mishkan, which was a mobile base hamikdash for Hashem in the desert. And they were told, you can do this, but don't do it on Shabbos. Which to us was not only instruction of when and when not to build the tabernacle, it was also a clue of what is allowed and not allowed on Shabbos. You can't build the Mishkan on Shabbos. Anything required to build the Mishkan is what you cannot do on Shabbos. So whatever was necessary for the building and construction becomes the categories, the 39 categories of what we can't do on Shabbos. And that is how we see in the text a reminder of what was given to us by Moshe directly from Hashem. Some things were dictated to be written, and many things were dictated by Hashem to be taught. Now, amazingly, we also have more spoken law, which is rabbinic in nature, protective, preventative legislation, which are add-ons, which we're also obligated to keep. But that's a separate story. Spirit of Shabbos is one of those examples. Muktzah on Shabbos is another example, which we'll hopefully get to talk about. Generally speaking, the 39 categories are of biblical level. Hashem told Moshe these ideas. We're going to show how actually the 39 are split up into 4 groups. It's funny, we were talking about how you have bubbles and support groups that you have now during COVID. It makes me remember that, of course, each law is its own category, but you can join things together. So we all have to have our own households, but different households can get together to form bubbles. There are 4 bubbles or 4 groupings of the 39 categories. One is the baking grouping, all the steps that it takes to bake, starting off with planting and watering and sun, plowing and harvesting and threshing and all that just to make flour, and then creating dough and then mixing it and baking, and all that's part of the baking group. How do you create cloth? So from being able to shear the wool of a sheep and then combing it and then spinning it and turning it into thread and weaving and sewing and cutting, and all that is part of making the cloth process, and that has 13 categories in that. The leather making process has again a whole thing where you trap an animal and you kill the animal and you take off the hide of the animal and you process it and then you cut it to size, and all that is included in the leather process making, and that's the 3rd group. And the 4th group is construction, in order to build. So whether it's digging up foundations, lining things up, drawing markings, and then building, putting things together, taking things apart in order to build it again. And the last one, which is part of or not part of the building category, is the carrying, or more strictly speaking, transferring items from one domain to another. And unfortunately, and we're going to talk about this for a second, the Eruv, which is carrying in an area that is a private domain, or at least halakhic private domain, unfortunately, in recent history, has become very lax, where people think it's okay to carry because it's not really that important. A big part of that is the fact that today the Eruv concept has become widespread. Now, what's an Eruv? We're going to take a moment to discuss an Eruv, but let's just say that regardless of an Eruv, carrying on Shabbos is as forbidden as lighting a fire, or in Jewish law, as forbidden as any other prohibition on Shabbos. Inside an Eruv, it's actually permitted, but that doesn't lessen the importance of how important it is to be careful with each one of the 39 categories. Now, we're not suggesting it's all or nothing, it really isn't, but we are saying that each one of these are very important. So what is an Eruv? An Eruv is where there are certain areas that rabbinically, as a protective legislation, were added on to say that we cannot carry or transfer in those areas as well. So biblically speaking, those areas were permissible to carry, but as a protective measure, those areas would then turn into additional areas, additional restrictions. Those additional restrictions were created with a qualifier, a clause that said that when an Eruv is set up in those areas, that's when will allow you to not have to carry on the additional restrictions, which is why an Eruv could never exist in very, very busy areas. So Oxford Street in London couldn't have an Eruv. In Long Island, they have the Long Island Expressway. You cannot have an Eruv over a very, very busy street. The simple difference is if there's 600,000 people that travel in that area or live in that area at a certain time, it's just not Eruvable, because that's biblically forbidden. Smaller areas are Eruvable because they are only rabbinical add-ons. That's an Eruv in a nutshell. Having that clause that was put into the actual restrictions, but transferring on Shabbos is really serious, and it's one of those categories. I want to put something out there. Shabbos is one of those mitzvahs that are equal in importance to the entire Torah. Someone who keeps Shabbos, and at least tries to keep Shabbos, is as if they've managed to try and keep the entire Torah on all the mitzvahs. And that's why these numbers 11, 13, 7, and 8, 11, 13, 7, and 8 are found somewhere else in mitzvahs. And it's in a mitzvah that reminds us also of the entire 613 grouping of mitzvahs. What are we referring to? Tzitzis.
Talis.
Talis. Your tzitzis, it says in the Shema, when you wear these tzitzis, and the mantisku is called mitzvahs Hashem, it shall remind us of all the mitzvahs. So when we see the strings, the uniform that we wear, it reminds us of who's in charge and will keep us doing the mitzvahs. And the strings of a talis are tied exactly the same way. 7, 8, 11, and 13. You see the tzitzis? I'm just going to see if I can bring up my strings right here. You will see that they're, I don't know if you can or can't see, but they're different sizes between each set of knots. And that's because they are a different amount. There's the 7 amount, the 8 amount, the 11 amount, the 13, and together they form 39. And together they make a reminder that helps us remember all the mitzvahs of Hashem. Shabbos is very special. Each one of those categories are enormous. Now, we could go through all the categories, which we're not going to do. Instead, we're going to pick a couple of examples, and then we're going to look at the practical application of these 39 categories and how it changes the most common areas of our life, or the most common changes that it makes in our life. I'm going to add on that the 39 categories are called categories because they are much more inclusive than just that. So let's start with the first one. The first of the 39 is sowing, planting. It's forbidden to take a seed and put it into the ground. And that's category number 1, because you're causing something to grow. In Hebrew, this would be called a av melacha, a parent work. And we said before, work means creative work. So it's a parent type of creative work. What makes it a parent? Parents have children. That's what makes them parents. So the parent melacha, the av melacha, has sub-creative works or activities that are also equally forbidden and are included in that category. So it's not just putting a seed in the ground that's forbidden, it's much more than that. There are other things that are also forbidden. What's an example of a subcategory that's forbidden, like sewing? Well, the way to work it out, we don't do it ourselves, we rely on the sages, but the way the sages work it out is they go down to what is the defining factors or the defining properties of what this work or active creative work is doing. So what I'm doing when I'm planting a seed is I'm causing the ground to give forth growth. I'm manipulating nature to make something grow. Anything that does that, even if it looks very different than taking seed and putting it in the ground, but if it's causing stuff to grow, that would be included as a secondary activity included in this group or category. Example given is watering. Watering the plants doesn't look like putting seeds in the ground, but it's the same idea. I'm taking nature and I'm manipulating it or causing it to grow better or grow more, and that would also be forbidden on Shabbos as part of planting. It's watering, but watering is secondary to growing. Which is more forbidden? They're both the same. They were both equally forbidden. One's just the name of the group, and one is a sub of that group. So is every apple food? Yes, but is every food an apple? No. And that's the idea. Every type of causing something to grow is forbidden. And sowing is just one example or the prime example that is used to name this category. But let's do another example here on the screen. One of the cloth making categories is sewing. What is the defining property or function of sewing? To take two items and permanently join them together through sewing. So you could have something that isn't sewing and doesn't look like sewing, but is doing the same function. It's bringing to, sorry? Go on. All right, we'll do this on the screen. Gluing. I might be gluing two things together. There's no thread, there's no needle, but it's the same idea. I'm permanently joining two items together, and that would be a subcategory of sewing. There's no father category, there's no parent category of gluing, but it's included as a subcategory of sewing. That's this kind of idea that you have. Just I'm going to name a couple of more. When you're tying a knot, which again is making a permanent tie, we'll have the same sort of idea. Tying knots is not allowed in Shabbos unless it's non-permanent, and non-permanent knots would be classically on your shoes. We cannot tie a double knot on our shoes. We can tie a knot on a bow, because a knot on a bow is not permanent. It loses that similarity. I'm going to do another example of a grouping, which is shearing. You're not allowed to shear and cut off the hair, the wool of an animal. A subcategory of that would be plucking out eyebrow hairs. It's the same sort of idea where I'm taking a growing hair and removing it for whatever purpose. But the idea is that I'm trying to take out a hair that's growing, just like I can't shear an animal. I can't pluck a hair on Shabbos. And let's do another example of kneading, making a dough, which is one of the group of baking, just like you can't make a dough, which is taking water to turn particles into a mass. I can't use water to turn particles into a mass by making myself porridge, even if there's no cooking involved. Because before I made the porridge, there were particles of oats, and I let it soak in water, and I come back, and it's one big thick mass. That's considered a secondary form of kneading, of making a dough. This is the kind of ideas that you get, and we can begin to imagine how inclusive the prohibitions of Shabbos could be, which is why you have books upon books and self-helps that help us master what is and what is not allowed in Shabbos. Once again, we're going to say it's not all or nothing. Every bit that we grow is an additional step. So we've said it's complicated, which is not wrong. What we're going to try and do is simplify it and do it the other way around. Instead of starting off with the rules, we're going to start off with how do I keep Shabbos from the beginning? What are the practical steps to keeping Shabbos, which is much simpler than studying text and studying a book of rules. And then instead of doing that, we go the other way around. Let's start off with how Shabbos looks, at least for the most obvious differences, starting from the beginning. Before we go further, does anyone have any questions, observations, or comments? Because if not, we're going to just dive right in.
Maybe
Please,
I have an observation.
I'm
I
listening.
think it is much easier to list what is allowed and say that everything else is forbidden. That's it.
Okay, what is allowed is to study the laws of Shabbos. What
Yes.
is allowed is to keep all the laws of Shabbos, and everything else is forbidden.
Yes.
No, let's not do it that way round. Let's talk about how we can be realistically keeping Shabbos. And I'm going to put some practical ideas on Shabbos. Again, I'm going to ask you to listen with an open mind. Open mind means it's not all or nothing. Just looking for which areas of what we're about to discuss would not make such a big deal in your life, but this little change, it's practical. One of the things you cannot do on Shabbos is tear things to a specific size. Okay? If you have a big sheet of leather and you want to cut it to be able to make shoes out of it, you're cutting it to measurement. That's one of the things you cannot do. It's mechatech, it's cutting something to size. A secondary example of that is taking toilet paper and cutting it to a particular size. You can't use a full roll, and you need to have a specific area. So what you do is you cut the piece of toilet paper when you need it. But that can't be done on Shabbos. So in order to avoid that, instead of using tissue rolls, we use a box of pre-cut tissues. How complicated is that? How tricky, how difficult is it to, instead of using a toilet roll, using a box of tissues? It's not so hard. That's one example. But if we care about it, then we can just prepare before Shabbos and say, you know what, besides getting wine from grape juice for Kiddush and getting candles to light, I'm going to get myself a box of tissues for Shabbos. That's an easy way to start the first step towards keeping Shabbos. And there you are. You're already winning. As we said, all of Shabbos is a steady journey of progress. A steady journey of progress means we do one more thing. So that's one example of how we can shift into a little bit more Shabbosdik each Shabbos. Let's put some more examples, practical applications. And this is probably the most noticeable change is when it comes to cooking and baking. Cooking and baking on Shabbos is out of the question for two reasons. First of all, you can't switch anything on Shabbos. You can't turn on your microwave. You can't turn on your oven. You can't turn on your fire or your gas or your electric. None of that can be switched on, nor can it be switched off, nor can it be lowered or higher. So cooking and baking on Shabbos, for starters, your heat element is out of the question on Shabbos. But even if it was to be left on or someone else had it on, you can't add anything to it. You can't put a pot of raw food onto a heat element or a heat source to be able to make it cook. And therefore, cooking and baking on Shabbos will be our first step of trying to navigate. Having hot food or warm food or cooked food on Shabbos will be our first step. And that would be, first of all, the suggestion is have it all cooked before Shabbos. And then if you, let's say you can leave it in your oven, turn your oven on before Shabbos for a half an hour, and the food is piping hot, and it's inside the oven. I just turn off the oven. I don't open the door. I leave it inside in a switched off, boiling hot oven, boiling hot food. From candle lighting time until I sit down to the meal, shouldn't be more than an hour or two. And by that time, when I open up the oven, the food is still piping hot. And that's a very practical way of just having your food ready before Shabbos begins. And thereby you have hot food for Shabbos. I've just switched off the oven and I've left it with the door closed. By the way, your challah, if you take challah and put it in the oven for a few minutes before Shabbos and toast it a bit and then leave it inside the oven, which is boiling hot, warm, crispy challah. It's another level. Okay. So well, it doesn't beat cholent, but yes, it's definitely the best way to challah. Okay. So we're talking about cooked and leaving it in the oven and the oven switched off. And that's it. You're not got the oven running over Shabbos. The other option is leave it on a hot plate. And leave it on a hot plate is a plug-in hot plate. And that, again, can either be on a timer or not on a timer. And leave it there before Shabbos begins, before candle lighting time. And there you are. You're good to go. Importantly, if you're using a gas flame or a flame that has controls on it, it's important to cover the flame with a blech. We're going to talk about for a second the word blech. It's Yiddish, and I'm not sure if it's German or not, but it means tin. Blech.
What does it mean?
Tin. Tin is a type of metal. How do you say it in Hebrew? Bedil, maybe?
Bedil. Okay.
Yeah, it means a tin. a
Yeah.
tin type of a sheet of tin that was commonly used. It was cheap to get, and they would use that to cover over the fire. And the reason for that is if my food has gone onto the fire and it's not fully edible yet, then we are concerned that as good chefs that Jewish people are known to be, we might come and be tempted or forget and not realize and come to adjust the flame. Or even not adjust the flame, stir up the pot that's cooking on the flame. And therefore, we need a reminder that we shouldn't forget it's Shabbos. And although we want to serve a delicious dish, we might have guests coming over. It doesn't allow us to adjust things on Shabbos. So as part of a preventative measure, if the food isn't 100% ready, we cover the flame. And that's if the flame is adjustable. So if it's a hot plate or a switched off oven, then we don't have to worry about it. And the switched off oven only works for ready food. But if it's a pot on top simmering of soup or of a stew that still needs some more time, we make sure that we cover the flame with a blech, with a cover. Tinfoil on its own is not a good idea because usually the fire will burn through the tinfoil and that becomes a hazard in itself. And we're going to learn that safety is number one. We did that already last week. Staying safe is your number one rule. Keeping Shabbos is in a way that's already safe. Okay, so number one is that we can put it on the oven. Number two is you can put it on a hot plate. Number three, you could cover the flame and leave it on a pot. And there you have your Friday night meal is sorted. The downside of you having a flame on is that you can't switch it off. Because as we said, turning off a fire, lowering a fire is not allowed on Shabbos. But if you have a hot plate, which is a plug-in one, then you can put it on a timer and it'll switch itself off. The upside of having a flame is Shabbos day. If you have a flame on a low flame, well, your cholent or your hot food for Shabbos day also wants to serve warm. Well, there you go. The same flame that's keeping your chicken soup or whatever else it is you're having for Friday night warm, you can use that same low flame, which is covered, and that can be for Shabbos day cholent as well. The other option is you have a hot plate, you might have a crock pot, a slow cooker, and keep your cholent in there. Again, that could be set to time, switch off once the cholent comes out, and Shabbos afternoon, your crock pot is safely switched off by the use of a timer. Now, we're going to get to the timer in a moment, but we are going to say you can't have the timer switch on the flame during Shabbos. You can't say, well, I only need my crock pot to come on 6 o'clock in the morning. That wouldn't be okay, because there you're setting the cooking to start on Shabbos, and that would be a problem of cooking, not so much of a flame. Okay, a couple of rules that are worth noting when it comes to the cooking and fire element of Shabbos. Remember, we said there's two prohibitions that we've got to watch out for. One being not cooking on Shabbos, and one being not turning up or down a flame. It's actually three prohibitions, but those two elements, the flame element, the heat source, and then separate to that is the cooking. They overlap quite a bit in this topic. It's not all or nothing. The parts that you can get involved in, please do start. So start of Shabbos, make sure your food is either raw or edible. Raw food, we don't think you're going to stew it or stir it because it's not going to help much anyhow. It's raw right now. Until tomorrow morning, it's going to do what it's going to do. Edible, it's fully edible. Again, we won't be so concerned that you're going to come to stir it. If those two elements are not there, we have to make sure to cover the heat source. Serving food. And this is important. If you've got a slow cooker and you want to just take a little bit of cholent before you daven, and you're smelling this delicious cholent in the morning, and you just want to have a small taste, we can't serve the cholent or anything that's on the heat source on Shabbos. We have to remove it from the heat source, and only then can we serve. What's the idea? Whilst it's still on the heat source, by putting your ladle in, you're almost definitely going to stir things up. And as you stir things up, that makes whatever's left on the fire when you leave it there cook better. Anyone who's done a bit of cooking knows that when you stir things up, it makes sure a better balance of the cooking. And that's not allowed on Shabbos because you're enhancing the cooking. So remove it from the fire before you serve yourself. Can you put it back? Carefully. How do you do it carefully? Well, number one, the fire's got to be covered. It's got to be still hot. And also, you cannot put down the pot anywhere. So chazara, which is the Hebrew word for returning a hot pot of food back onto its heat source on Shabbos, requires 3 steps. Number one, the food is still hot. Number two, the fire isn't open flame. You've got a reminder element there. And number 3, I don't let go. I'm not forgetting about it. And thereby, I'm sure I'm remembering. Why am I still holding this pot of cholent while I'm serving myself? Because I know that I have to put it down carefully within the frame of Shabbos and make sure I'm not going to stoke the flames or anything of the sort. So serving food from a high heat source on Shabbos is restriction. Is this making sense? So far, so good? Nobody's nodding. Oh, some of us are nodding. Okay.
Can you please just clarify about the stirring? What happens when you stir? What you just helping
Because
keeping
it's
the food obviously to be all balanced.
and it's still on the heat source, so it's still on the stove or in the slow cooker.
Why can't you stir it?
So megis is the Hebrew word for it. Steering it whilst it's still on the flame, still on the heat source, is considered bringing the parts that were further away from the fire closer to the fire, so that will cook better and it'll be better tasty. In other words, I'm making the parts that were further away from the fire come closer to the fire on Shabbos. I'm enhancing the cooking process.
But everything is already cooked. You're supposed to when I cook the cholent, I make sure it's already cooked.
Correct, but
So
still
what
stir
happens when I
it.
stir it on Shabbos?
The
No,
reason
I'm
why
not gonna cook it anymore. It doesn't cook it anymore.
Oh yes, let me tell you the rules of cholent. The longer it cooks, the better it tastes. As long as it doesn't burn. But the longer it cooks, the better it tastes. You know the story of the guy who was in shul and he sees on Yom Kippur everyone's there crying and crying, and it seems like, what's everyone crying about? He realizes they must be so hungry, and then they stop crying. He's like, all right, the stomach settled. Why did the stomach settle when they went on? He realizes that they must be thinking that the longer the cholent stays on the fire, the better it's going to get. So they stopped crying in Yom Kippur. That's the little anecdote. But yeah, the rule is the longer something stays on the fire, the better. But also, the closer it is to the heat source, the more it's going to cook. If you think about why we stir food on a fire ever, that's generally the reason why a chef might stir up the food. Obviously, that the part shouldn't burn, but that the top part should become closer and then become better and become more tender, wherever it is it's going to be. Yes, please.
One
Can I ask you if you could? Oh.
Yeah, Maxim will go first and you go next. Go on.
For example,
Oh.
I want to serve cholent.
Yes.
Does it mean
good idea.
that the entire pot of cholent I take off the hob? I bring it to the dining table. I put it on the dining table and I cannot release. I need to serve everybody and bring it back to the heat source? Or if I released my hands from the pot, that's it. It cannot go back on the hob. Do I understand correctly?
Correct. Once you release it, you put it down totally, then you can't put it back. Generally speaking, yes. So
Okay.
if you plan on taking a little taster in the morning and then putting it back for the afternoon, so then you take it and take a little scoop and put it back. But once you've finished, you're taking it out and you're going to serve it and you don't need it to stay warm, that's when you take it off and you let go. It doesn't either comes to the table or you do it in the kitchen, whatever it is. But yes, you understood correctly.
Okay, thank you.
Who else? Go on.
Hello.
Yeah, we're listening.
Yeah. But I've just seen another question I want to ask. Return hot food to covered fire, no putting down.
Yeah, so this is what we're talking about here. In order to take the cholent pot and serve a little bit and then put it back on the heat source for later, 3 steps.
Yes.
The food has to be hot, the fire has to be covered, and whilst I'm serving, I can't put it down totally. The truth is, I'm going to tell you a little life hack, and that is you could put it down so long as you're also supporting it. Practically speaking, if you lean the pot at the edge of a countertop and you're supporting it so that if you removed your hand, the pot would fall off the countertop, so it's not totally on, then your hand is still considered holding it up, because although you're holding it together with the countertop, but you're holding it, and that's enough to be considered holding it. You're not forgetting about it. If you forget about it for 1 second, the whole pot's going to flip over. That's considered enough of holding it. Does that make sense?
No, sorry, I may be a bit thick here. It's the bit that says no putting down I'm having a problem with.
So you can't put down the pot if you plan on returning it to the heat source. If you don't plan on returning it, then you're fine. You're good to go. Just put it down on the counter. You're good to serve.
Right, I'm with you.
Put it back. Yeah, is that making sense?
Yeah, right. So I've got a couple of questions. I'll be very quick. Yeah.
We're listening.
If the flame goes off accidentally by itself when you've got the blech over it, and then the flame just goes off by itself, what do you do then? Because it could be dangerous, isn't it?
If it's a gas flame and the gas is coming out, so the
Yeah.
simplest thing is to turn off the gas, which is no problem, to turn off the
Right.
gas if there's no flame. But you could check with your local Orthodox competent practicing rabbi to check whether it's a tzorech gadol. There are certain times where one is allowed to ask a non-Jewish person who doesn't have to keep Shabbos to do things.
All right.
Generally, it's forbidden, but under
Yeah.
extreme circumstances, say you have guests coming around or whatever it is, it can't be done usually. But sometimes there's a way to make it be able to be done, not by a Jewish person, but including a number of other factors. It's a bit complicated and detailed, but that's generally the simple answer. Anything else you're going to ask?
Yeah. I've heard that there's some rules around adding liquid. It's quite complicated, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit beyond the scope today. But beyond
Sorry?
the scope what we can talk, a bit more than we were going to discuss today. Generally, the
Okay.
answer is you can't. There are
Right.
certain ways to do it. If it's directly from an urn directly into the pot and it's not on the fire, but then the urn. We're going to talk
All
about
right.
some of that soon, but generally not. Generally, the answer is you can't add anything to a pot that you're going to put onto the heat source because that
Right. My
additional
last question.
liquid. Sorry.
Sorry, my last question is, I've seen some people, even on Shabbat, put like their challah to warm it on top of the Shabbat kettle.
There we go. You've just taken it and put it straight on the screen. Here you look. You're allowed to
Yeah.
place dry cooked food not directly onto a fire, but onto a pot that's on top of the fire. And this is the idea
Right.
of mechse k'mavashal. Something that's fully
Right.
baked. A challah was a good example that you had there. Something that's totally dry food and it's fully baked or cooked is not going to cook anymore. But
Yeah.
we worry it shouldn't look like we're cooking. And that's what
Yeah.
we're concerned about. And then we don't put it directly
Okay.
into an oven, but you can put it on top of something else. These are very
Okay.
detailed laws, but we're going to just quickly go through a few more of them.
Okay.
You're allowed to warm up stuff, not on the
Okay.
fire, but near the fire, so long as the place you're putting it would never allow it to become properly hot. So say, for
Right.
example, you've got a very cold drink of water. You want to just make it a little warmer. You put it next to the heat range. It's never going to boil over there, but it's going to warm up. That's allowed because it's not going to cook.
Okay.
Similarly, if you have anything left in the oven, you can't take out part of the food because whichever's left in there, the thermostat of any normal oven, or at least modern oven, is going to kick in and bring the heat up. Any food that's left in the oven afterwards is going to benefit from the fact that I've opened the door and closed it. It's going to switch on the thermostat. And that's something we should take into account. Within is a thermostat controlled heat element that will be changed based on my action. So if I've chosen to do something that will affect that and affect that directly, that could be problematic. Last but not least, water is a separate category. Water has to be fully boiled before Shabbos begins. The most practical idea is having an urn. A hot water urn keeps the water hot, warm the whole time, and it's cooked before Shabbos, and that's the practical thing. There is someone mentioned here about making a hot drink on Shabbos. The sort of it is we can't put hot water on top of coffee because that hot water is hot enough to cook the coffee. And same as with tea. You can't put hot water directly on tea on Shabbos. But there is a way around it, and it's not just a hack. It actually makes sense. Klisheni, you'll have a cup in between. A dry cup gets filled up with water, and that's cup number 1, which is utensil number 2, because the hot water cooks in here, and it gets poured into the dry cup. From there, we pour into an additional cup. By the time the water gets here, the water is on its way cooling down. The water is not retaining its heat because the heat source was over here. As the water comes in, it starts to cool down. This cup has never been hot yet, and therefore the walls of this cup are bringing the temperature down, not up. And thereby it becomes more permissible to add coffee to that water. So effectively, if you're making yourself a coffee or a tea on Shabbos, it's not rocket science. It's not so hard. Just do one additional cup in between. If you're adding something to your hot water or to your hot soup or to anything else that's a hot liquid, just put one utensil in between. and thereby the walls of the third utensil, as in the second cup, are helping the temperature of the water go down, drop in temperature, and thereby are not going to be actively cooking the coffee. It's more passive, which makes it permissible. We're not going to get into the reasoning, but it's not so hard to do this part of Shabbos and just make it work. We have an urn, we have a middle cup, and then we have the cup in which we are adding stuff to the liquid. Electricity is a big one. Forbidden to have electricity. Different schools of thought what the problem are. There may be multiple problems with electricity, but practically it means you can't open a light on Shabbos. A very good example of opening a light on Shabbos is if there's a light on your fridge. Every time I open the door, I'm opening the light. So some modern fridges have Shabbos mode, or they switch off the light, or you can just put a piece of tape over the sensor or the switch. The switch is on the light every Friday, or keep it there in general, and then opening the door of the fridge will be a non-problem. Amazingly, if you open the door, the light switch is on. What happens when you close the door? The light switch is off, which is again another problem of electricity on Shabbos. Light switches in general, just prepare before Shabbos, switch on the lights in the rooms that you want the lights to be on, the bathroom, your hallway, your downstairs, whatever it is. On your bedroom, you want to switch off the lights, so switch it off before Shabbos. Some houses actually get a timer, a hardwired timer installed onto your lights for Shabbos. But this is something we can do. Leave the bathroom lights on for 25 hours. Get an LED bulb, so it's not going to cost you too much in electricity. But it's not so hard to not switch the lights on and off on Shabbos. Timers are allowed, but only if it doesn't break the spirit of Shabbos. Spirit of Shabbos is a rabbinic add-on, and therefore having your TV come on to watch the game on Shabbos isn't allowed rabbinically because it breaks the spirit of Shabbos. But a timer for something that enhances the spirit of Shabbos, such as lights or heating, is allowed. And therefore, practically, the only time we really use timers is for heating sources and lights. Everything else is pretty much, if you need it to come on, chances are it's not something that's in the spirit of Shabbos and it can't be used. Elevators, lifts. Going into a lift on Shabbos, you can't push the buttons on Shabbos, that would be electricity. But there are lifts that are Shabbos modes. I believe in Heathlands, they have a Shabbos lift. Certain areas where the Shabbos lift goes up and down on a preset timer, that would be allowed, because creating circuits, driving a car is not allowed. And that brings us to the second thing, driving a car. You cannot own a Shabbos car. Shabbos car doesn't exist, because driving a car is already with electricity, with a combustion, and even more so, and therefore it's prohibited to drive a car on Shabbos, but instead we walk. But even walking has its own little bits of restriction. You cannot transfer and carry unless there's an Eruv. We mentioned this earlier. So what do we do with our keys? How do we get in and out of the house on Shabbos? And for this, the answer is there's a way to do it that makes it kosher. You can wear clothing. You can wear a belt for your clothing. If the key is an active part of the belt, then it's not just a key, it's also a belt. If you look closely, these keys in this picture have not just one hole, but have at least two holes. And the reason for that is because now the key is a link in that belt. Should the key not be a link in the belt, it's just hanging on the belt, that's not allowed. That wouldn't be a part of the belt. That's like trying to manipulate the halacha. But if the key is a part of the belt, then it works. I'm going to end off with one thought. And this thought is that although we've spoken about his we missed Moksa, we'll skip it. Havdalah we missed. We're going to talk very quickly about Havdalah, just like it's a mitzvah.
What about Suda Shlishit?
We're going to get there in a moment. We were talking about that. Just like Havdalah is Kiddush is how we bring in Shabbos. We take a cup of wine and sanctify the day of Shabbos when it begins. We sanctify the day of Shabbos when it closes. Amazingly, this is in most mystical teachings a coping ceremony that helps us deal with the loss of our godly soul. We had an additional soul that came to inspire us and be with us all of Shabbos. And as Shabbos closes, we have Havdalah. Havdalah is a ceremony in which we have a multi-sensory ceremony that includes looking at the fire, smelling the fragrance of a refreshing smell, and drinking, tasting the wine of joy that will help us transition from the holiness of Shabbos to the regular mundane life. Amazingly, all the verses that we read in the Havdalah talk about having faith in Hashem and not being afraid. But going back to the idea of a Havdalah, the separation, generally we think of separation as a bad thing. In Jewish teachings, differences are sacred. The only way we can bring things together is if we recognize and treasure the differences that we have. And it's important for us to know Shabbos is holy and the weekday is mundane, out there and we go get it. And when we have the Havdalah, the difference, we can then bring the goodness, the holiness, the specialty that we experienced of Shabbos and bring it into all of the rest of the week. And in a sense, I'm going to ask you to notice that the topic of this course was Judaism at home. Judaism is our connection to our soul. And bringing that to the home means bringing the connection between the elevated, higher ideas and making that part of our home. We've timed out, we've learned, I think, an enormous amount. In today's class, we covered quite well. We covered the beginning idea of what Shabbos means to us and the restrictions. We covered some of the categories that are not allowed. And we did a little bit of a practical Shabbos. I'm going to ask each one of you to try and think of one area of anything we learned in the course and everything we learned in the class, and try and think of one place that we can put it into a practical, steady growth and put it into the real world, into our real life. Because this is really the point of what we're learning here. Make our home more shining. And now, as thank God, lockdown is slowly lifting, by the time we finish lockdown, we'll be shining ourselves. So not only will our home benefit from our shine, but that benefit will spill over to our neighbors, our friends, our acquaintances, and thereby will be a light unto the nations, will be a sharing and spreading light. Thank you, every one of you, for joining.
Amen. Ken Yeh Ratzon.
I'm going to
almost like a blessing there.
Absolutely. It is certainly a blessing. And I would like to say, I don't know if I have everyone's email, but if I do, I would like to share the quiz revision or reviser that we're going to send out. If I don't have your email address, please do share it with me. You can put it on the chat or you can send me an email. It's rabbilevi@lechaim.org.uk. And if you send me an email, we'll add you to the mailing list, and thereby I'll be able to share this revision. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, I'm always happy to further and continue this discussion. Thank you all for joining. Stay safe, stay positive, and stay uplifted.
Thank
you
you.
for joining.
Thank you. Good
Good
Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Levi,
Question time.
I've learned that if I know that I'm not going to see you until Shabbos, then anytime in the week, if I know that I'm not going to see you in the week, I wish you good Shabbos.
Thank you. And to you. Well said.
Unless you're going to surprise me.
You never know.
Never
Can I
know.
just ask a question?
Come again?
Can I just ask one question?
Please do.
You know, on Shabbos, can you use Alexa to switch your lights on and off?
Oh, you can't use Alexa. And actually, there's some funny stories of actually a Chabad rabbi. One of my colleagues was saying that he just got Alexa and he was sitting at his Shabbos dinner and he was telling his friends about this amazing innovation of Alexa. You can just tell it to switch on music. And Alexa picked it up. And in the middle of the Shabbos meal, all of a sudden he's got music playing because he said Alexa overheard the conversation. No, but Alexa is actually not a separate. I mean, the truth is, generally speaking, you can't have anybody do something that I can't do. If they're doing it for me, I can't benefit from that. So let's say somebody who doesn't have to keep Shabbos, it's not Jewish.
Alexa's a computer.
It is a computer, but Alexa only does what you tell it to do. So if Alexa is my agent, it's as if I push the button, at least over voice, and ask that button to do whatever I'm doing, which makes it forbidden. Great question. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a good Shabbos. Night.
Thanks very much. Take care. Any other questions?
yes, Levi.
Go ahead.
What about reading? If I'm not reading Torah, other reading is allowed.
Yes. The truth is, reading itself is not considered any of the prohibitions. It's actually highly commendable to spend time inwards, focusing inwards. However, you do mention about wasting time on Shabbos is not allowed. It's not allowed in general. So if you're reading something that is not beneficial to anything, just in order to distract yourself, that's questionable whatever day of the week. If it's going to help you, if it's going to help you relax, if it's going to help you be more productive, if it's going to help you focus, then it's commendable. Then it's commendable. Yes, so reading is a very good pastime for Shabbos. It's one of those things that it's not manipulating human skill and knowledge to change nature. Instead, it's studying, and it's reading and making you a better person. That's very good. That's a good idea. But I highly commend learning Torah. It's good.
I know. Thank you.
Jenny, go ahead.
Yeah, Steve asked this, not me. Can you, is resting, sleeping on Shabbos also not, is it frowned upon or not?
Shina b'Shabbos tainug. It's considered pleasure to sleep, and therefore it's commendable.
Really?
It's actually in the halacha on Shabbos morning. One should wake up a little later, sleep in a bit on Shabbos. Different people have different expectations of what's considered sleeping in. Some people, an extra 2 minutes after 6 o'clock, it's already they slept in 2 more minutes. And for some people, anything less than 9:30 is not considered sleeping in. But we did learn about saying Shema on time, and therefore, even if a person's going to sleep in, one could, in theory, say Shema and go back to bed. But it's important to bear in mind saying Shema before the latest time to say Shema.
Yeah, can I actually, that just brings me to something else a bit different. You know, if you say, when you wake up and you say Modeh Ani, yeah?
Yes.
Right, you can't go back to sleep then, surely, because that's something else. That's something else, because you can't keep on saying it. You say it once in the morning, you're telling me that you can go back to sleep, and then when you wake up again, you're going to say it? It's just once, isn't it?
So you definitely can go to sleep again. I've tried it before. It works.
Okay. You've really got another job, you know. I'm sure you're a stand-up comedian as well on other nights. Hey?
But
Anyway.
I was going to say that saying Modeh Ani has to be the first thing I do in the day.
Right.
Let's just say I get up and I take care of the kids and whatever I do in the morning, and then I take a nap during the day. That would be
Right.
allowed for sure. So taking a nap first thing in the morning is not so bad. The point is that I took a nap consciously. I didn't take a nap because I'm lazy. I didn't take a nap because I can't be bothered, but I took a nap because I made a conscious, clever decision that that's the right thing for me to do. Then it's the right thing to do. Sometimes after saying Shema. So let's just say it's in the summer months where the latest time to say Shema is 8:30.
Right.
But I know I went to sleep so late because it's the summer and I don't have to be in shul for a certain amount of time. I need to say Shema, so I'll get up and I'll say my Shema, but I'll make a good decision to go and have another half an hour of rest. Sometimes that's the right thing to do. And sometimes Yiddish mamas need to hear this more than the counterparts, just because
Right.
you push yourself too hard, and it's important to look after your health, your physical health also.
Right. Okay. I think
Did I answer the question?
No, because I was asking you also about when you say Modeh, when you say that first in the morning, first thing. Why you said it and you've got up, and then if you go back to sleep
Yes?
and you go back, you're just saying it's a nap.
Right. It's still the first thing you did in the morning was Modeh Ani, and the
Yeah.
second thing was going back to sleep. But at least the first thing you did was Modeh Ani.
Right, I'm with you, yeah, because you say it because you've woken up during the night. Okay.
But you will be right in saying that you've got to wash your hands again after waking up. So once you've woken up from your nap, you would wash your hands again. Not with a bracha, but you'd wash your hands a second time. Every time a person goes to sleep, they wash their hands. Every time we go to the bathroom, we wash our hands. Yeah, not with a bracha. The bracha is only said once a day on a titas dime, unless you're eating bread. But washing your hands every time we go to sleep, every time we go to the bathroom, every time we take a bath or a shower, every time we cut our nails, or if we cut our hair.
Interesting. Okay, good.
Yeah?
Yeah, right.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? Stephen? No, we're fine.
Not yet.
Are we going
Okay.
to when are you coming back? Is
The
this a
truth
break
is,
now?
the truth is next week, the kids are off school.
Oh, right.
So things become a little more hectic.
Yeah.
So, but we'll still have the Monday evening ladies parashah shir and the Sunday morning men's parashah shir.
Right.
But we'll see about the Wednesday. We'll see when it's going to come back on. I'll send out an email.
All right. Oh, okay. Good. All right. Thank you.
Look after yourself, everybody. Have a wonderful summer.
Thank
you for joining.
Oh, yeah.
David.
Call to take
Call
care.
to. We've got one more question, Anna.
No, just thank
No.
you. Have a good night.
Anytime. Keep on learning Torah. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Shalom.
Shabbat shalom, Hannah.
Bye.
Take care. Send regards.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.